Welcome along to a webinar presented by Computer Information Agency. This webinar will cover the basics of SharePoint administration. My name is Robert Crane. You can contact me via an email, director@ciaops.com. If you want more information about my business, please visit www.ciaops.com. So let's get started. First of all, let's just cover a little bit of housekeeping. If you have access to Twitter, feel free to use the #CIAOps tag to put in your comments about today's session. That will allow me to view the feedback that's being provided. If you want to connect with me via Twitter, you will find that my Twitter handle is DirectorCIA. Information about obtaining a resources guide will be available at the end of the session. So with that, let's kick off and start with our agenda. First thing that we'll look at is that any installation of SharePoint has a number of dependencies. These dependencies are other software such as Windows or SQL. We'll then go into the site management. This basically shows you how to administer the basics of a SharePoint site from within that site. Next, we'll look at the central administration website. This again is more powerful interface and allows you to do higher level administration. We'll next look at the STS ADM command, which is a command prompt level tool. The advantage here is that some things that can't be done in central administration can only be done using the STS ADM command. We'll then look at database management. So one of the most critical components of any SharePoint installation is the databases in which the content for SharePoint lives. So again, part of any administration of SharePoint will require the understanding at a basic level of SQL. We'll then have a look at some security, how SharePoint handles its securities, and finally we'll end up on a conclusion. So the important thing to think about with SharePoint is that it's not simply a product that's standalone. It requires a number of other technologies for it to operate. The first of these being Windows Server. So at this stage, the current version of SharePoint, being Windows SharePoint version 3, requires a Windows Server 2003 or better, so 2003 and 2008. The newer versions of SharePoint, the one that's currently in beta, SharePoint 2010, requires a 64-bit operating system only. You'll also find that you need to have the Internet Information Server, or IIS, installed and configured on a server. This is because SharePoint is a web application, which means that it has to serve web pages. In Windows Server 2008, for example, this means that the IIS server needs to be installed as a component because it's not installed by default. So if you're running SharePoint on a Windows Server 2008, you will need to make sure that IIS and a number of its dependencies are also installed. Finally, you'll need to use SQL Server. Now, generally, SharePoint, when it is installed, if it cannot detect an existing SQL Server installation, it will install its own version. Now, there are a number of different versions of SQL Server, starting with SQL Server Embedded Edition, all the way up to SQL Enterprise Edition. All of these can be used and have different levels of functionality and limitations that you need to be aware of. But generally in this case, what we'll examine is the most basic level SQL Server, which is installed with Windows SharePoint services, that being the embedded edition of SQL. So what we'll do now is we'll go out and have a look at some of these dependencies. So let me just go out to the example server that we'll be working on. So hopefully here you can see the desktop of the server that we'll be looking at today. This is actually a Windows Small Business Server 2008 machine. You'll need to appreciate that I'm running this in a virtual environment, so some of the performance may be a little poor, because again it's just a demo machine. As I spoke about, SharePoint has a number of dependencies, the first of these being Windows Server. If we have a look at the services in a Windows Server, you'll notice that it has already installed the Windows internal database, which is known as Microsoft #SSEE. And basically what this is the internal database that that SharePoint uses to store its content information. You'll also notice that there are a number of Windows SharePoint services that are installed and configured. So again, if you are having issues with Windows SharePoint, the first thing obviously to do is to check that these services are operational. So apart from Windows Server dependency, we also have a requirement for Internet Information Server. So in this case, if we have a look at the IIS console, you'll see that there is a site that is configured called SBS SharePoint. Okay, that's its ID, and in this case it's running on port 997 as well as port 80. So again, to get information about this, we simply right mouse click, we can manage the website, and we can have a look at the advanced settings. So in the advanced settings, you'll see what it binds to. So again, because it's an SBS box, you'll see it's binding on a secure port of 987 as well as a normal port 80, and it has a host header, or known as company web. Again, you've got the physical location of where it's installed, and again you've got connection limits and other things. So again, if you are having issues, one of the dependencies, remember that it is IIS. So again, the website here, we can start, we can stop, we can delete, we can do all sorts of things here. So again, we can restart it, we can stop it. So again, something to check. What you'll also find is that not only is there a website, but there is also an application pool. So if you have a look here, you'll see that there's an SBS SharePoint app pool. Okay, so this is an application pool which is required for the functionality of IIS. So again, when working and maintaining or administrating the site, or if there are issues, you need to check obviously some of the dependencies, and the dependencies are obviously the services and the functionality and operation of IIS. Now the final dependency that we talked about previously was the SQL. Now you'll see that on SBS we have Microsoft SQL Server 2005 installed, and we have this component, the Management Studio Express. Now, because this is a 2008 server with enhanced security, what I'll need to do to access that is to right mouse click on it, and I will need to run that as the administrator. If I fail to do this, I may not be able to complete a number of standard operations using the SQL management tool. So I accept the UAC acknowledgement, and I will find that the management console will launch in a second. Now, because the situation on SBS 2008 is the content databases are stored in the Microsoft SQL Embedded Edition, there is a special unique string that's required to access that database server, and what we'll find is that that string can be a little bit complex. So what I'll do while this is still loading up is, you'll need to note that when I access the management console here, I'll have to access it using the following strings. So //dot/pipe /MSSQL $Microsoft #SSEE/SQL/query. So this is the string that I will need to insert into my server name here. Otherwise you won't be able to connect. So once I've done that and I select Connect, what we should see is we will see that we have access to the database server, and again in this case it stands for SQL Embedded Edition, and you'll see that under this databases heading we will note the databases that are available. So in this case, again, because it's Small Business Server, we see that we have the Software Update Services database, but we also have the WSS, the Windows SharePoint Services Content Database, and also the Search Database. So if we right mouse click on this, we'll notice that we have a number of tasks that we can also perform on this database. So part of the option may be that we need to move these databases if they grow, which is an area I'll cover a little bit later. So again, we can simply detach these, move them using File and Copy, and then reattach them. Another important option to look at is the shrink option. So obviously, because it's an SQL database, what happens is when it's installed normally, it's installed in full recovery mode. So what this means is that there are significant transaction logs kept for the SQL processing. And if not maintained correctly, these can grow to a very significant size very quickly. So again, using some of the utilities that are part of SQL will allow us to maintain our SharePoint databases and our SharePoint content much more effectively. So they're the three most important dependencies that we have in this situation: the Windows Server, the SQL databases, and also the IIS. So the first step in the management of Windows SharePoint is you can manage a lot of the features from within the site. So to access these features, you do it simply via a browser. Basically, all you need to do is to browse to the site and then select the specific option. Obviously, you'll need the rights to achieve this. Again, this is something that's set up in the securities of the SharePoint site. If a user does not have access to this functionality, it will not even appear on their page. This is known as security trimming within SharePoint. So again, the advantage is that if you're not an administrator of the site, many of the admin options will not even appear. So again, all these administration options I will show you are found on the existing SharePoint site, and any changes that you make will only affect the current site or the list that you're working on. So again, they're limited simply to the site that is currently displayed. And it is possible to have a number of different sites or sub-sites in SharePoint, and again, the administration for each is localized. So if we return to our server and we bring up our site and just connect back up, so what we should see is our normal SharePoint site. As you can see in the top right hand corner, it denotes who I'm logged in as. So I'm logged in as the system administrator, and as you can see, a number of additional options are available. So I have this option over here, okay, as well as a number of others I'll show you. But the very first stage, let's have a look at a document library. So this is a standard document library. Okay, what I can do as a user is obviously create new documents and upload new documents. However, as an administrator, I also have this option here for settings. So if I go down here into the document library settings, what I'm able to see is a number of administration features for this document library. So as you can see, I'm able to create additional columns, I'm able to edit additional columns, I'm able to create a number or edit the views. But up the top you'll see that I can change the title, the navigation, set the versioning settings as to whether a document requires checkout and check-in, and whether a document requires approval. So again, these functions can simply be turned on and off in a library as required by an administrator. And as you can see, we also have the ability to delete the document library, and we can also save it as a template. So here we are in the version settings. As you can see at the moment, it is turned off. I can set major or minor versions, and again I can set who sees the drafts for these documents. So again, this is all contained in the settings for a document library list or whatever. And again, what we've got here you'll find is under permissions, we can set the permissions for this individual library. So at the moment you'll notice that the permissions tell me that this library inherits permissions from its parent website. So very much in a tree structure, like a standard file system, the SharePoint site inherits its information from the site above it. So again, going into the settings for the document library or list allows you to firstly customize the columns, customize the views, and also set up a number of advanced options. So again, that option is available. So if we go and have a look at our calendar, a similar option will be available under settings for the list settings of the column. So that's the first place that you can start to administer your site. And again, that administration can be delegated out to users with suitable rights. So you don't necessarily need to be a full system administrator of SharePoint to have access to the advanced features of a document library or lists. You can allocate certain individuals to have those rights to alleviate the administration burden. So at the next level, we have site actions. So what I can do here, for example, is if I go into Site Actions, I can create a new item to display in SharePoint. So what I'll do here is I will select to create a wiki library, which I will call a knowledge base. I will create that knowledge base, and you'll see in a minute when it's created, it will now appear in the Quick Launch menu on the left-hand side of my SharePoint site. So here I am in my knowledge base, KB. The knowledge base appears in the Quick Start menu on the left. And again, I can go in here and I can edit and work on the document library settings. I can go into any document. I can edit it. And I can make the changes that's required. So again, because we've got a wiki, we can just go in here in and edit and maybe change the color of the text, and we go OK, and you'll see this has been updated to display. So again, if we go into Site Settings under Create, we'll note that we're able to create additional document libraries, form libraries, wiki libraries, picture libraries, announcements, discussion boards, and a whole list of additional items. Okay, so returning to the home page, if we go to Site Settings again, you'll see that the second option that's available is to edit this page. The page that's displayed here is known as a web parts page. It basically has a number of different areas that pull information from parts within SharePoint. So if I select to edit this page, I'm now put into an edit function where I can now work with the web part. So this part here is a web part. This part here is a web part. I can drag and drop and move these around. So for example, if I wanted to move the links to appear above the calendar, I can simply drag and drop that and let it go here. And now I have rearranged my page. You'll notice that within each web part there's also an edit function. So again, I can choose to modify this web part from the menu that appears. And then on the right hand side you'll see the number of options that are displayed in relation to this web part. So I can set features like its height, its width, how it displays, all different sorts of options. I can address its layout, and I can also set a number of advanced features. So when I'm finished, I can apply that to update it, and that will then display the new options that I've selected. If I were to what the good thing about SharePoint is that it is full of many different web parts. So again, if I click on the option up here to add a web part, what I'm able to do now is to select from a list of web parts that are available within SharePoint. So for example, what I have is I can display my announcements, my calendar, my fax center, links, pictures, as well as a number of miscellaneous web parts in here. So for example, what I can choose is that I can use, for example, the content editor web part to display, say, YouTube videos or Google Maps. So I can embed this web part onto a page, position it where I desire, and actually have it linked to other websites. So again, the way that you modify a web part page is from the site actions, drag and drop, make the changes that you require. You can edit each individual web part via the edit menu and then modify the shared web part option. When you're finished, you just simply exit the edit mode and you'll now see that my page has been returned, but my links area now appears in the middle column rather than here over on the right. So that's the function of the edit page. Now, edit the page only functions with web part pages. Okay, so there's special pages that are created. Again, if you go up to create, you'll see here web part page. So once I create a web part page, I can then go in and edit them. So again, because we're now not on a web part page, that option doesn't appear. The final option here in this menu under Site Actions is Site Settings. In Site Settings, you'll see there are a number of other administrative tools that you can select. So I can work on the people and the groups. This is the securities area which we'll cover. One of the most important things, or one of the most items you may need to pay attention to, is a site, what's known as a Site Collection Administrator. A Site Collection Administrator are given full control over the website. So in many cases, if a website has to be migrated or is moved between domains, it will have a user who is no longer part of the domain. You may need to go in and select a new user and give them rights. So you can type the user's name in here, or you can use this option here, and you can browse for a person in your network on your Active Directory and allocate them to being a Site Collection Administrator. Now, it's important here to note that a Site Collection Administrator does not necessarily have to be an administrator of the network. You may choose to make somebody who is normally not a network administrator an administrator of the SharePoint site. This would allow them to perform all the functions of administration without having to give them elevated rights into the file system. So the first issue about about SharePoint securities is that they can be separated from your normal network security. Okay, so we can change the look and the feel, the title, the description, little icon that appears up the top here. We can set a theme, that's the colors and the display. The top link bar, what we can do is we can add a number of different tabs up here and we can point them to whatever we want. The quick launch bar is what appears down the left-hand side here, and for example, what I can do is I can go in here and I can change the order, for example. So if I want the knowledge base article, a knowledge base library that I created to appear as number 1, I simply select that, make the modification to the arrangement, click OK, and then if I return to my company web, you'll see that KB now appears in the top list over here. So again, the site settings allows me to do that. Another interesting thing is the ability to save a site as a template. So if you create a site that has relevance in other customers or other areas, you can save what you've created and then repurpose that elsewhere. You can set a number of list templates. You can also import web parts. You can work with workflows. SharePoint workflows basically allow you to complete a number of standard tasks in a standard manner. So what I'll do here in site administration, as you can see, my regional settings are incorrect. Unfortunately, that's the case in all default small business server installations. So all I do is simply go into this, select the region that I'm after, the time zone, how I want my dates to appear, select OK, and my regional settings will now be correct. Another feature that I'd recommend you enable is Site Usage Report. So by default, Site Usage Reports are not enabled. We'll look at how to do that under the Central Administration. A Site Usage Report will show you the activity, a basic report on the activity of your website. So this will give you a better indication of what users are visiting, what sites they're working on. Another handy feature that's worthwhile examining is user alerts. So what you will find is that in document libraries, users can end up creating alerts. So what happens is they create an alert so that when something changes, they are then sent an email that informs them about that change and also links to that change. But as you can appreciate, once users sometimes discover this feature, they tend to go overboard with alerts, and it is hard to track them necessarily to delete them if required. So again, what I can do here is I can select the alerts for different libraries. I can then delete the selected alert. So again, this gives me a central location I can come to manage the user alerts. Alright, so if I have a number of sites and workspaces, they will appear, and if I want, I can delete the sites. Another important feature that is new to SharePoint version 3 is the recycle bin. So if we return to our home page, you'll notice down here that I have a recycle bin. So generally, most things that are deleted end up here in what's known as the user's recycle bin. They can then restore them from this recycle bin, or they can delete them. The advantage with version 3 is, as you'll note, that there is also a site collection recycle bin. So what that means is that if the user deletes something from their own recycle bin, it will end up in the site collection recycle bin. So it's a two-stage recycle bin. So again, over here on the left, you'll see we can look at the end user's recycle bin, okay, as well as the site collection recycle bin. And again, you've got a number of other features which are covered here. So again, this option is under Site Settings. So in summary, just go back to the home page. Under Site Actions, you have the ability to create additional items for SharePoint. You have the ability to edit web part pages. And you also have the ability under Site Settings to do a lot of the administration for the site. Now, it's important to note that this Site Actions is only available when an administrator is logged in to the site. So we'll just swap back to the slides. Okay, the next level of administration is what's known as central administration. Again, you access this via a web browser. However, the central administration is a separate SharePoint site that you normally access from the SharePoint server's console. Okay, it can be accessed over the network because it does have a unique port. However, it's normally accessed via the SharePoint server. Another important thing to remember here is that any changes that are made can affect the whole SharePoint installation. So again, this is another level up. You're potentially working on every part of the SharePoint installation. So if we go back to our site here, you'll find that the administration is under the administration tools, and you'll see In this case, it's SharePoint 3 Central Administration. So I've already loaded that over here. And you'll note that basically it has 3 tabs: Home, Operations, and Application Management. The home page just gives you a list of to-do items as well as how your topology or the number of servers you have installed. It's important to remember that although in this case with Small Business Server we only have a single server, it is possible to install Windows SharePoint in what's known as a farm. So this allows you to have multiple servers to serve different applications. So you may have one server that's the database server, you may have another server to handle all the web requests, and you may have a third server to do the indexing. So it's important to remember that although in most cases with Windows SharePoint you will see only a single server, it is possible to migrate these out to a multi-farm, multi-server, what's known as a farm topology. And in many cases you see this with the more upmarket version of SharePoint, the Microsoft Office SharePoint Server. So again, this is very much a SharePoint site. So if we click on the Operations tab, you'll notice that these operations normally work on the complete installation of SharePoint. So what you've got here, again, you've got them nicely divided out by topic. So if we look at the servers in the farm, again, just because this is a single SharePoint server, we only had the single server. But it's important to notice that this gives you the version number. So again, depending on the service packs that are installed and whatnot, you may need to check the version number of the SharePoint software. You'll also find that what we've got here is, again, a number of different services operate on this server. If we had multiple servers, it is possible to have different services such as search running on different services. So in a farm topology where we have multiple servers, we can view these services and start and stop them as required. You'll see another important thing is the outgoing mail settings. Typically when you install SharePoint, this will not be configured. It is in this case because it's Small Business Server, but generally the outbound SMTP server is not complete. So again, this allows SharePoint to send alerts, to send updates and information to users. All you need to do is point it to an SMTP server, which is typically your Exchange server. You'll notice that it's also possible to have emails come in from outside the business directly into SharePoint. Okay, so you can enable sites on the server to receive emails. And again, what you can do if you want is you can actually integrate this with your Active Directory. So it allows you to create a new site, enable email for that site, and then for that email address to automatically appear in your Active Directory on your Exchange list, so it will start receiving mail. Okay, so again, the email server address is listed here. If we have a look at the service accounts, okay, so these are the admin accounts or the service accounts to run the different services, to run the web application pools, to run the Windows services if required. Okay, so generally once that's set up, they don't need to be fiddled with. What may also happen here is that it is possible, as you know, to upload a whole range of files to SharePoint document libraries. However, if you are getting problems uploading certain files, you may find that they are part of the automatically blocked file types. So, for example, if you try to upload a BAT file, you would find that it is blocked along with COM and, I believe, EXE files. So again, to unblock them, all you need to do is simply remove that entry. To allow additional blocked file types, you simply add the extension. So that can be a handy feature to prevent users from uploading large video files. Down here we have the option for diagnostic logging. So if we get problems with SharePoint, it's currently set to a fairly minimal level of logging, but if you want, you can increase the level of these logging. So what you can do is, again, you can set it up to log the error reports, also to have throttling on what sort of events you want to see. So again, you can choose which events you want to see and how critical they are. And you'll notice that by default that the path that is created is in a directory called Web Server Extensions 12/logs, and it supports by default 96 logs, and it uses them for 30 minutes. So if you do need to look at the logs, you'll find them in this directory, which we'll cover in a little more detail when we get to the command prompt level. So what we've got here is the timer jobs. These are the jobs that SharePoint is constantly running, for example, to send mail, to log, to monitor statistics. So again, this gives you an idea of when these jobs run and how often they run. One thing I neglected to indicate was that the usage analysis processing, as you can see, by default is turned off. So to enable that, which I'd recommend you do in all instances, and enable it to run in the middle of the night. So once this runs and is configured, you will now start seeing usage logs in the site settings. And this can be a very handy option when you're trying to see exactly how your users are using the site. So again, there are a number of additional features that you can plug into SharePoint. You can download a number of different enhancements, and these are typically called features. And you can add these features in. Once these features are in your SharePoint site, they can be enabled or disabled as required. Now you'll notice here that under Operations, I have the option to do a backup and restore. So if I select the option to do a backup, I can, for example, choose to do just the search services, the web application, or the administration, or by doing the whole lot. So again, what this will do is this will create and run a backup and store it in a particular location on my server. Once that backup has been complete, I can then obviously go in and I can restore from that particular backup. Okay, so you give it a location, a UNC location, and it will back up the data and the whole website. Now the issue we have here is as you can appreciate, is that this is simply a manual process. There is no easy way to automate this through the graphical user interface. So this typically, if it needs to be run, would have to be a once-off, and is generally inflexible in most cases. There are better ways to perform that, but it is available. Finally, you'll notice here that we have a default database server. So at the moment, our default database server is Microsoft #SSE, so the embedded edition of SQL. If you want, you can change that default location. So if, for example, you install the full version of Microsoft SQL, you can change the default database to point to that. The issue you need to remember is that any databases that you created in the previous default database will remain there and still operate, still be accessible. So if you're planning to migrate your whole database across to a more powerful version of SQL and remove the original version, you will not only need to change the default database server, you will also need to move the databases from where they currently reside. So, if we now have a look at application management, you'll see that I have the ability here to create or extend a web application. So basically, when I create a site, I create a unique web application. This gives it independence from other sites, so I can choose to create a site inside the same web application, but obviously if it becomes unstable or bloated or takes a lot of memory, then it will also create instabilities within other web applications, other sites that are sharing that web application. So the normal best practice is always to create a new web application for each site collection that you're working on to give it independence. And as you can see, I can remove SharePoint from this IIS website if I so desire. I can delete web applications, right, and I can manage the outgoing settings. I can look at the general settings for each web application. So again, I can set a time zone for my web applications. I can set a quota being the amount of information that a user can store on the site. And typically you'll notice here that the maximum upload size is 50 megabytes. So if you try and upload a file that is greater than 50 megabytes by default to a SharePoint site, you will normally receive an error. So if you need to bump this up, you need to go into here and to change the maximum upload size. Okay, so again, I can turn the alerts off on my server. I can set up the maximum number that a user can create, enable RSS feeds, all sorts of information here that can be changed or modified. And a good example here is you look at the recycle bin. You'll see that by default it's on, and it will delete items out of the recycle bin, the first stage recycle bin, every 30 days. So once a month it will go through and clear out old files automatically. In the second stage, okay, what it can hear is we've got quotas. Okay, so again, you can control the recycle bin status from within this option here, which is Web Application General Settings. We'll notice that the content databases, so at the moment we have one content database. This is the area which stores all the SharePoint information. I can have multiple content databases if I want, but typically when a site is created, it's created within a single content database. And as you can see, I can select whether it's ready. I can take it offline if I require. And importantly, what is generally missed in many cases when creating a site is that you don't select a search server. So if you don't have a search server set for your content database, you are not going to have any search results that are displayed. Okay, so that was our content databases. We can look at our web application list. So this will list all the SharePoint sites that are currently configured on our server. With SBS, I have two. I have my standard SharePoint site on port 987, and I also have my administration site, which is what I'm working in here. And you can add as many additional sites as you want. Okay, so what we can also do down here in application security, if you note, is that by default, the authentication provider is set to be Windows. This means it's picking up its securities from Active Directory. But SharePoint can configure its securities to come from SQL Server, to come from a number of different areas. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Active Directory. So again, what I can do is, if I want to create a new site collection, I simply go in here, create a new site collection. I have to give it a title, obviously, and a URL. This is the URL it will appear on. And when I create it, I can select from a number of different templates. So I've got a blank site, a team site, document site, meetings. And as you'll note down here is when I create a site, I nominate the primary site collection administrator and a secondary one, which is optional. So if you remember, a primary site collection administrator is the person who has complete rights over the site and does not necessarily have to be a network administrator. So again, I can create as many site collections as I want, and these will live with their data inside the content databases and will run inside a web application. I can delete a site collection, so once I create one, I can delete it. I can set quota templates. Again, I can go in here and select and set the site collection administrators. So if you're unable to access a SharePoint site because it has been migrated, again, you can simply come into the central administration, application management, select the site you want to work on, and again set the primary and the secondary administrator so that they have rights to the whole site. Okay, so that's basically the central administration. You run that from typically the server console. You have the operations options listed here, and you have the application management options listed here. So again, operations tend to work on the servers and the services within the installation. The application management tab is generally working on the web applications and the sites within those web applications. So the next level we have is the command prompt. Okay, the command prompt we use a command utility called STSadmin. It's accessed from the SharePoint server, and the advantage here is we have the ability to script it because it's a command prompt option. So typically this is, for example, how we would use something to do our regular backups of SharePoint. So if I go back to my SharePoint site and minimize this and go to my command prompt, you will find that the directory in which the STSadm command is located is in C, Program Files, Common Files, Microsoft Shared, Web Server Extensions 12/bin. If I type STSadm, you'll be given a list of all the functions and the parameters of the STSadm command. So again, typically you run it like STSadm -o for operation, add path, URL, blah, 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 with the requirement. So as you can see, there are a significant number of operations that can be run and can be scripted via this command. So a typical example is if we want to do a backup, we would run STSadm -o, we would run backup -URL, http://company-web -file name, we'll call it c:/backup.dat and -overwrite. So this will overwrite any existing file. It will run a backup operation on this URL and store it in this file that we've nominated. And again, because this is a command line interface, what I can do is I can obviously put this in a batch file, and then I can schedule this batch file to run. So again, obviously you want to run this backup in the middle of the night because it makes the SharePoint site read-only during the backup. But as you can see, the operation has completed correctly. If I do a dir of the directory, I should see that it has created a backup.dat file of 355,920 bytes, which I can then restore. So again, there are a number of different options at a command line level you can access. You can create a number of different batch files to achieve what you need to achieve, and you need to be aware that some of these STSadm commands are some of these commands are only available in STSadm. They are not available in the web GUI interface. One of the others that I will point you towards that is a fairly new command that is well worth exploring is the export operation. This allows, if I do a backup, it simply backs up a site, so it will back up company web and nothing underneath it. With the export, I can set it to export the whole site from the top all the way down the bottom and maintain all the securities. The preferred Microsoft migration option from SharePoint version 2 on SBS 2003 to SharePoint version 3 on SBS 2008 involves the use of an export. So because SBS 2008 already has an existing SharePoint site, any existing site is exported to a file and then imported into the existing site so that the information is combined. If you do a backup and a restore, it will simply generally overwrite the whole site that exists at that location. So again, I would suggest that for migration purposes, you have a look at the export command. I would also suggest that as well as doing an STS ADM backup, it is well worth your while to also do an STS ADM export to a different file to give you the flexibility to work and move any potential site, in the case of a disaster, to another server. So in summary, the STS ADM command is accessed from a command line on the server console. You'll find that command line program in the directory C:program files, common files, Microsoft shared, web server extension, /12/bin. You'll also need to be aware that the next version that's currently in beta, SharePoint 2010, will take advantage of PowerShell scripts. So again, it's well worthwhile learning some of the PowerShell scripts to improve the management going forward. So as we get towards the end, let's have a quick look at the database management. Again, normally accessed from the SharePoint server console, requires the installation of the SQL management tools on the SharePoint server. So we covered this quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time delving into the depths of SQL management, but again, you saw our SQL management console that we had to log into with the specific string. You'll notice our content databases for WSS content and also the search. Again, we can work with a number of different tasks here to detach, to shrink, and you'll notice that in SQL we also have the ability to back these databases up. So depending on the version of SQL that you have, it may also support the ability to automate via SQL the backup of the databases. So in theory, you could back up using the graphical user interface manually. You could back up using the STS ADM command. You could use the backup of SQL, and obviously again you could use the Windows file level backups as well. So there are a number of different backup options that can be configured to suit your requirements. Now, probably the biggest questions people have about the databases is actually where do these files reside. So again, if you look at the properties of the database, you should be able to tell where that database is. Okay, so it won't connect for me. So I know in this case that by default, that's the connection string. I note that by default in SBS, and when you install SharePoint version 3 without any other options, that by default the databases end up in C, Windows, SYSMSI, SSEE, MSSQL.2005, MSSQL data. So again, these files have ended up on my C drive, which obviously in general case is my system drive. So again, as the SharePoint databases grow, and you'll notice I have not only WS content, but I also have a WSS_content log file. These log files, especially for the search log, can grow to be quite significant. So again, part of the SBS wizards allows you to move these databases to another location. That is highly recommended. However, it is possible using the tools here, so I can, for example, detach the database, copy and paste it to a new location, and then I can reattach the database to SQL. So again, I can attach a new database, and this allows me to basically move the data around without causing any interruption to SharePoint, without having to do any configuration, because SharePoint simply looks to SQL to get its database information. And again, the database, the SQL version you use, will dictate the number of tools and functionalities that is available to you. But in this case, by default, you will get the embedded edition, which will give you a number of standard tools, number of standard functions, and if you don't have this console available, this Studio Express console, it can be downloaded independently and installed on the server. So again, if SharePoint is installed, it doesn't install it generally with the management tools, but you can simply download these from Microsoft and install them on a server, so you can access your databases via a GUI interface. So we're running out of time here, so I will quickly run over the security. We need to separate our security from our NTFS. They're inherited by default. You can break them if you require, and the important thing is you can set them per item. So let's just have a very quick look at that. So again, if I return to my SharePoint site, okay, and if I go to my shared documents, you'll notice that if I go to my library settings, as we spoke about, if I go to the permissions for this document library, you'll notice that it's inheriting these permissions from the parent site. But what I can do here is I can now edit the permissions, right? So I'm going to copy the permissions from the parent and then stop inheriting. So I'm going to break the inheritance, which I've now done. Okay, use this page to assign users and groups. So what I can now do is I can now add a user specifically to this library. So I pick that user, I go OK, it checks it. I want to give that user what sort of permission. So I might want to give that user full rights. I can then choose to send them or not send them an email. I won't send them an email. I go OK. So now you'll see in my list of rights that I've given an individual user access to this library. So if I now choose to get rid of these default ones, this now means that the only person who has access to this shared documents library is basically me. And again, what I can also do is I can also not only do it by individuals, but if we come out of here, you'll find that under people and groups, I can create a group just like I create a group in Active Directory. So again, what I can do in here is I can create a group called Shared Documents. I can make myself the only member. Oops, sorry, that's a description. Then I can choose whether to view, set up how the if members can see each other, whether they have to have requests to leave or join the group, and what sort of control they have over the site or over the area that I'm setting. So typically what's a good idea is that once you create a group, you use the SharePoint group to assign rights to whatever you require, but then what I would suggest is you can add users, but users, notice here that I can add groups. So the recommendation is that you create SharePoint groups to control your securities, and inside those groups you put your Active Directory groups. So this means as you add users to Active Directory groups, they automatically get access to the SharePoint without you having to come in and give people individual permissions. So having a quick look at the knowledge base. So what I can do in here is you'll see that each item, what I need to do is I can view the properties and I can manage the permissions of this individual item. At the moment, this document inherits permissions from its library. Okay, to manage the permissions directly, you can edit them. So what if I go, for example, out of here to my my normal website. This is a website that I have that's available on the internet. That's accessible via supportweb.ciaops.net.au, and you'll find that you can log into it as an anonymous user. So, for example, you can see that when it comes up, that at the moment I'm logged in as an anonymous user. It hasn't got any login information. So again, over here you'll notice that it's logged in. I've logged in as a user, so probably not a good example. So let me just return to the slides and keep going, rather than get hung up on that. But basically what it allows you to do, I can set the rights for individual documents, so when an individual comes into a library, they're only able to access the documents that they've been given specific rights to. So the main takeaway from the securities is that you can set the rights on a site, you can set the rights on an item, you can set the rights on an individual item within a document library or a list, and those rights can be separated from your normal network rights. So in conclusion, SharePoint administration involves a number of different levels which we talked about, from a graphical user interface all the way up to a command prompt. SharePoint is obviously administered through a GUI, and again, typically the lower level access administration is done through a GUI, and the higher level is done through the command prompt on the actual server. And again, as I spoke about, if you desire, typically the SharePoint securities can differ from the normal NTFS, so they don't necessarily have to pick up from what you're using on your network. They can use your Active Directory users and groups, but then create their own set of rights. And typically what many organizations do is they give the administration of their SharePoint site, or what they call their intranet, to a different level of users and let them maintain different areas rather than having a single man or single person operate that. So that basically concludes our session for today. I apologise that we ran a bit over time and didn't leave enough for security, but that may be available in a future webcast. I will send an email to all who attended as a follow-up, indicating that there's a survey. If you could complete the survey and give me some feedback on what you thought about today, this obviously helps me improve my content. For those who complete the survey and enter their email address, you'll receive a resources guide based on today's session, so some handy links and information on SharePoint. Just let you know that there are always future presentations. My plan is continuing to run these webinars on every second Thursday morning at 10 o'clock Sydney time. And again, the best place to find out information on that is my blog. I'd just like to again let you know that I have created a SharePoint operations guide, which I believe is the most comprehensive guide available on Windows SharePoint. Many people on this call are already subscribers. And one of the big benefits they receive is they have free access to all these webinars now and also to download in the future. So for more information about that SharePoint Operations Guide, have a look at www.wssops.com. And finally, please feel free to send me an email directly with any feedback, comments or suggestions you may have. And don't forget to stay tuned to the blog address there, where I will update all information about SharePoint, especially the newest version available, as well as any webinars that become available. I thank you very much for attending today's session. I hope that you got something out of it, and I'll wish you the best for today. Thank you very much.